So I'm a big history guy, and if there's one thing history is full of, it's unmitigated tragedy. So when I heard about the Indifferent Stars Above, I knew I had to read it so I could tell you all about the Donner Party. The Indifferent Stars Above follows the Donner Party broadly and follows one family specifically, the Graves family. Even more specifically, the eldest daughter, Sarah. Sarah Graves was born in 1825 and lived most of her life in Steuben Township, Illinois, with her father Franklin and her mother Elizabeth, along with their 8 younger siblings, Mary Ann, Billy, Eleanor, Lavina, Nancy, Jonathan, Franklin Jr., and Elizabeth, all aged between 1 and 20 years old. On April 12, 1846, the 11 members of the Graves family, along with a hired hand by the name of John Snyder and Sarah's newly married husband Jay Fosdick, set out for the west in a small train of 3 wagons, 3 of some 7,000 that would set out west in the year 1846. Now, I'm sure you're wondering why they were leaving. I mean, why on earth would anyone ever want to leave Illinois?
Well, this sucks.
Besides, the obvious reasons, it turns out there were a lot of legitimate reasons why living in central Illinois in 1846 really sucked. One of these reasons was the ague, or Illinois shakes, a disease which swept through the American heartland in the early 1800s. Symptoms included high fever, chills, blinding headaches, stiffness, aching joints, anemia, and violent, uncontrollable shaking. It was a chronic problem that would go away in a week, then come back weeks, months, or even years later. At the time, this was blamed on miasmas, or stagnant air and damp weather. Today, it's more commonly known as malaria, and we know that it's spread by mosquitoes, but this connection wasn't made until the late 1800s. Then there was the Panic of 1837, which was caused by real estate speculation. In April and May of 1837, 343 of the nation's 850 banks collapsed. By 1842, wheat that cost 50 cents to produce was selling for 25 cents, if a buyer could even be found. But the biggest reason for leaving was a little thing called Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was a 19th century doctrine that many early Western settlers followed. According to Manifest Destiny, the expansion of the United States through the American continent was both inevitable and justified. At the time, Oregon was jointly and uneasily held by both the United States and Great Britain. California was a sovereign Mexican territory, but the thing is, nobody really cared. Basically, none of the immigrants to California complied with the Mexican government's requirement to obtain immigration documentation and become fully fledged Mexican citizens. Most of the American settlers just ignored the rule and became undocumented immigrants in California, since, after all, the land was theirs thanks to Manifest Destiny. But let's bring our focus back to the Graves family wagons. We've talked about the reasons for leaving, but how exactly does one get out west? Well, look no further than The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, published in 1845 by Lansford Hastings. He told of the, quote, vast extent of its valleys and plains, the, quote, unexhausted and inexhaustible resources, and the extraordinary variety and abundance of its productions, and boasted of a shortcut to California in his book that would shave several hundred miles off of the trip. Quote, the most direct route, the California immigrants, would be to leave the Oregon route, about 200 miles east from Fort Hall, thence bearing southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down to the Bay of St. Francisco by the route just described. There was one major problem with this. Hastings had never taken the route. The route actually ran through the Wasatch Mountains, which were full of steep canyons, boulders, and other environmental hazards that could easily break their wagons. But one of the cool things about living in the 19th century was that you could just make stuff up and nobody would really be able to verify whether or not what you said was true. Unfortunately, the Graves family weren't the only ones to read Hastings' book. Just 100 miles south of Steuben Township, 4 days later, a 32-person wagon train led by Irish immigrant James Reed and the brothers Jacob and George Donner departed Springfield, Illinois, for the same initial destination of the Graves, Independence, Missouri. At Independence, travelers had their last chance to stock up on supplies before hitting the open trail. Recommended provisions looked something like, quote, at least 200 pounds of flour a meal, 150 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar,
55 burgers, 55 fries, 55 tacos,
and 10 pounds of salt. All of this cargo meant that the wagons could weigh more than 3,000 pounds for the 5 to 6 month trip across the plains to the west. The Donners left Independence on May 12th, with the Graves family following behind them a week or two later. They were cutting it close. Hastings said in his book that immigrants must, quote, enter on their journey on or before the first day of May, after which time they must never leave, which was one of the few things that he actually didn't lie about. On June 27th, the party arrives at Fort Laramie and is warned about taking the Hastings cutoff by mountaineer James Clyman, a man whom James Reed knew. Reed asked him about the new route, and Clyman told him to take the regular wagon track and never to leave it. Despite this, Reed walked away from the conversation believing the Hastings cutoff would work. On July 17th, a rider bearing an open letter to all California immigrants from Hastings offered them to press on to Fort Bridger, where Hastings himself would escort them across the new trail. On July 20th, 20 wagons turned left to Fort Bridger at the Little Sandy River, while all of the others in the train continued on the established path. On July 21st, George Donner is selected as the captain of the expedition over James Reed, whose fancy-pants aristocratic manner had rubbed some of the more down-to-earth families the wrong way. Now, the Donner Party is formally established, and the wagons are en route to California via the Hastings cutoff, after spending 4 days at Fort Bridger. After a week of smooth sailing, moving deeper and deeper into the Wasatch Mountains, the Donners encounter a note from Hastings advising that the road ahead is nearly impassable and to wait for him to show them a better route. Unfortunately, this is where the trouble started to begin. Now the group would need to forge new roads across the landscape, eating up valuable time and effort. On August 10th, the Graves family joins the Donner Party, and on August 22nd, the Donners exit the Wasatch Mountains. It takes 16 days to make the 35 miles through the Wasatch Mountains, when they were told it might take just a week. On August 31st, the group comes to see the expanse of the Great Salt Desert for the first time. Hastings told them the crossing would be 40 miles, but they could now see that it would be at least double that. 36 oxen did not survive the trek across. On September 10th, an inventory of all provisions was taken. It was determined that they did not have enough food to last them through to California. Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon volunteered to ride ahead to California for provisions from Sutter's Fort, carrying a promissory note from James Reed to pay back whatever was borrowed. On September 26th, the party reached the Humboldt River, where the Hastings cutoff rejoins the old trail. The cutoff was not only more dangerous, but 125 miles longer, and would add another month to the journey. At this point, morale was low and tensions ran high, but things were about to get much worse. On October the 5th, something happened in the Nevada desert at Pata Pass that has been disputed ever since 1846. While driving double teams of oxen up the steep incline, Franklin Graves' wagon team, under the care of John Snyder, became tangled with the Reed wagon, which was under the care of a man named Milt Elliott. This sparks a heated argument between Elliott and Snyder, who begin trading curses with each other until James Reed arrives back from hunting in the middle of the argument. More hot words are exchanged between the parties, until finally Snyder raises his bullwhip to strike Reed, who draws his knife. Snyder strikes Reed twice with his whip before Margaret Reed, his wife, tries to intervene, but Snyder hits her with the whip in the process. Enraged, Reed stabs Snyder in the chest, killing him. Among the party, Snyder was popular, Reed considerably less so. The people on Snyder's side readily labeled Reed's actions cold-blooded murder, but Reed maintained that his actions were justified self-defense. The wagons convened to decide what to do next, and affidavits were taken for a possible trial in California, though many did not want to wait that long. Louis Keseberg demanded that Reed be hanged on the spot. Ultimately, the party decided that Reed would be banished with no weapons or provisions. In the unsettled American West, this was the closest to a fair trial he was going to get. The next day, Reed attended Snyder's funeral, then headed west alone. In the night, Reed's daughter Virginia and the driver Milt Elliott leave camp and overtake him, giving him meager provisions and a rifle. But Snyder's death was only the beginning. On October 7th, Louis Keseberg kicked an old man by the name of Hardcoop from his wagon, telling the old man to walk or die. Hardcoop was not taken in elsewhere, and he eventually fell behind, with no one willing to backtrack and go in search of him. On October 11th, a group of Paiute Indians attacked the party, making off with 18 heads of cattle and killing another 21. Later on, the group could hear the Paiutes laughing at them from a nearby bluff. On October 19th, relief from Sutter's Fort arrived after over a month. McCutcheon stayed at the fort after having fallen ill, and Stanton returns with 7 mules loaded with food and 2 Miwok Native American guides by the name of Louis and Salvador. He also brings news that the High Sierra Pass will be free of snow for another month. The Donners camped for 5 days, 50 miles from the summit. While waiting for the Donner wagon, which had broken an axle, snow hit the summit, leaving the party stranded for the winter. They had missed the weather window by 1 day, and needed to turn back from the summit to camp at Truckee Lake, meaning that they traveled 2,500 miles in 7 months just to stop 150 miles from safety. 81 members of the party, 25 men, 15 women, and 41 children were split between 2 winter camps at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, with the Donners at Alder Creek 6 miles away. At this point, the last of the animals were slaughtered for food. By December 16th, Franklin Graves decided that he'd had enough and began creating snowshoes out of oxbows and rawhide. He went from shelter to shelter, recruiting the most able-bodied among the emigrants to join him in breaking away from the party. This breakout attempt consisted of 15 people. 9 men, 5 women, and a boy of 13 years old. It was dubbed the Snowshoe Party, but historian Charles McClashen coined the name it is more commonly known by today, the Forlorn Hope, which might give you a clue about what happens next. By the 6th day out, the Forlorn Hope had run out of food. By the 9th day, they were hopelessly lost in the California mountains. On December 23rd, Patrick Dolan suggested casting lots to see who should die so that the others might live by eating the dead. Patrick Dolan picks the fatal lot, but no one is willing to kill him. At about 11 p.m. the next day, December 24th, Franklin Graves dies in the arms of his daughters. The next day, Patrick Dolan goes insane, running into the snow half naked. The rest of the party drags him in to the rough circle around the fire. He dies that afternoon on Christmas Day. The morning of December 27th, the group decides to consume the flesh of the bodies, including Antonio, Franklin, Patrick Dolan, and the boy Lemuel. The settlers divided into groups so that no one would have to eat their kin. Louis and Salvador, the Native American guides, would have no part in the ordeal. By the evening of January the 4th, the group had been without food for several days. William Foster proposed killing Louis and Salvador for food, much to the disagreement of William Eddy. That night, Eddy secretly tells Louis and Salvador about Foster's plan. They slip away into the dark and disappear. On January 5th, Jay Fosdick passed away a little before midnight, with his wife Sarah Graves by his side, days after falling behind the group. William and Sarah Foster ask point blank to eat Jay, to which Sarah responds, quote, "You cannot hurt him now." Working westward, the remaining members of the Forlorn Hope came across Louis and Salvador, the Miwok guides who disappeared after learning that their lives were in peril. William Foster proceeds to kill them both in cold blood, and they are cannibalized by the group. After wandering for another 2 or 3 days, the group of 7 discovered footprints in the mud and snow. Human footprints. They had come across a Maidu village, possibly the village of Tequima in modern-day Colfax, California. At first, the Maidu retreated in fear from the emaciated white settlers, who approached with arms outstretched, imploring for aid. Eventually, they led them to their huts and began to nurse the remaining members of the Forlorn Hope back to health. On January 17th, 15-year-old Harriet Ritchie saw 2 figures coming down the Bear River, one Native American and one white man. With bloodied feet and sunken eyes, the white man used his remaining strength to whisper a single word: bread, causing Harriet to burst into tears. The man was William Eddy. On February 4th, 14 men set out from Johnson's ranch as the first relief. On February 17th, they camped at the summit overlooking Truckee Lake. They guessed the snow to be as deep as 30 feet. On February 18th, they descended the cliffs and crossed the frozen Truckee Lake. Once they reached the other side, rescuer Daniel Rhodes raised a loud "Hello!" The gaunt figure of Lavina Murphy emerged to meet them, asking, quote, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" On February 22nd, 22 members of the First Relief set off into the snow to salvation. Patty Reed told her mother Margaret, quote, "Well, Ma, if you never see me again, do the best you can, in the most 19th century way possible." The Second Relief, headed by James Reed, took on 17 members, 3 adults and 14 children. The Third Relief would leave on the afternoon of March 12th. Their rescue would leave only 4 living members of the Donner Party at the camp: George and Tamsin Donner, Louis Keseberg, and Lavina Murphy. The Fourth Relief leaves Johnson's ranch on April the 13th. It wasn't so much a relief party as a salvage operation looking to recover gold, silver, and goods from the Donner wagon train. Upon arriving, the relief party was astonished to find Louis Keseberg alive, surrounded by the bones of Tamsin and George Donner. Of the 87 people who made it to the Wasatch Mountains, only 48 of them survived. In the aftermath, surprisingly, most of the survivors went on to live normal lives. For her part, Sarah Graves became a school teacher and married a man named William Dill Ritchie, until he was hanged for apparently having stolen a pair of mules, because what else happens to a man in 1854? Donner Memorial State Park was established in California in 1828, and Truckee Lake was renamed to Donner Lake. The pass that the party traveled through is now known today as Donner Pass, and a memorial to the Donner Party was erected in the park in 1918 on the former campsite. The plaque on the front of the memorial reads, quote, "Virile to risk and find, kindly withal and a ready help, facing the brunt of fate, indomitable, unafraid." In modern times, the story of the Donner Party is transformed into something like a tragic folk tale. There seems to be an almost mythological quality to the story. It's easy to see why people get so enamored with it. It's a story of tragedies that befell ordinary working American families who were simply searching for a better life. But let's take a step back and talk about why exactly the tragedy happened. Remember Manifest Destiny, that thing we talked about earlier? The idea that westward expansion was inevitable and justified? The Donner Party was just one example of the victims of Manifest Destiny. Mostly, this was due to the party following the directions of a man who had never taken the route he claimed was superior to the typical trails that the other settlers were taking. The mad rush to pack up and move west as fast as possible and claim your own patch of, quote, unsettled land was a mindset that ended up getting a lot of people seriously injured or killed. The Donner Party were just one of many groups that set out for California, only to never make it to the land of prosperity they were promised. We also can't forget about the countless Native American populations that were displaced and disrupted by settlers moving across the country. Because of this Manifest Destiny doctrine, many people fell prey to opportunists promising them a better life. The story of the Donner Party is a grim reminder that the path to greatness may not always be what it seems. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Leave us a like if you enjoyed the video, leave a dislike if you hated it. Leave us a comment, tell us what sort of stuff you'd like to see next. We're looking for different topics that we can use for these videos, or just, you know, tell us how we did. This is our first time doing this, so yeah, thanks for watching everybody.